Hello Squadrons fans, this is Gimbal Lock. You may have seen me in-game in the past as Attack Duck. I think I changed my name around mid-December to be consistent across all platforms. So the other day I enabled voice chat for the first time, and the first thing that I hear is some people discussing my stats and wondering how it was even possible for someone to have a KDR as high as me. And then more recently, someone posted a screenshot of my stats on Reddit, which started this discussion about, again, how it was possible for someone to do that and whether it was a bug or whether I was doing something to artificially manipulate my stats. And the answer is that it's neither of those things. I have never quit a match before, either in progress or in the lobby. All of my matches have been on the same account, and they've all been solo queue. The reality is that there is no simple hack or anything that you can do to get a KDR this high, which is why I decided to create this lengthy video to get into more depth about how I was able to achieve this. And the great thing about video is I can show some gameplay clips to illustrate some of the things that I'm talking about. This video has two purposes. One is just to satiate the curiosity of anyone wondering how this is possible. And the other is to convey some of the things that I've learned in the months that I've been playing this game, in the hopes that some people might be able to use that information and improve. And, even if you can't use the information or you don't want to, approach the game that way, which is fine because there are many different ways to approach the game, hopefully it can give you some insight into what some people are doing, which can give you some ideas into how you might counter those things. Everything that I'm going to be talking about in this video is with regards to public dogfight matches, so it may not apply to fleet battles or custom matches or tournaments. I'll be talking about the specific loadout that I use and the tactics around that loadout towards the end of the video, so if you just want to jump straight to that, you can use the timestamps in the video description below. But before that, I'm going to talk a bit about my background and some of the equipment that I'm using, as I think that those are things that play an important role in how I got to this point as well. I don't claim to be the best player in the world by any means, and I actually consider myself to be pretty casual. My stats, for the most part, while not bad, are not particularly notable, save one, and that's average deaths, which is the lowest that I have ever come across. And keep in mind that this is career average, so if you were to just look at, say, the last couple of weeks, it would be a lot less. It's not uncommon for me to go 100 kills or more in between deaths, and this to me is the key to getting a high KDR. As the number of deaths used in the calculation approaches 0, your KDR approaches infinity. Now obviously everyone will die at some point, so you have to still be getting kills as well to offset those deaths, but staying alive is rule number one. I do think I have a couple of advantages that other players might not, that I think have influenced my KDR, so I wanted to mention those. The first is my background. I've been playing flight sims since I was a kid. I got into X-Wing in 1993. I think I was 12 at the time. And to this day, my favorite game of all time is X-Wing Alliance, which was the last game in the series. So I've played all those games to death. I was into other space combat games as well. I'm into civil flight sims and am a real-world aviator, although I don't think that that's particularly relevant to this game. In 2007, I got into Track IR, which got me into World War I and II flight sims, as head tracking is so critical for up-close and personal dogfighting. And then a few years ago, I got into VR. So I came to Squadrons with a lot of experience with dogfighting, with tracking targets with my head, with space sims, and I think all of those things allowed me to start Squadrons at a higher level than players without that kind of background. To kind of quantify that, my KDR started around 3 and hit 5 within my first few days of playing dogfight. So for someone who doesn't have that kind of background, I'm not saying you can't achieve that, it's just that if your performance wasn't very good at the beginning of your career, then that period is going to end up getting averaged in with your later performance, even if you progressed quickly, and so that's going to bring your stats down. So I think being able to start at that higher level from the beginning is a significant part of the reason why I'm at the level where I am today. I mentioned before that I use VR, and so far 100% of my matches have been with VR. Now that Track IR is in the game, the argument could be made that it's superior to VR from a competitive standpoint. Certainly I think that that's the case for World War I and II sims. but less so with this game due to the targeting cues. But in any event, I think that head tracking, whether VR or track IR, is a huge advantage in ships with good visibility, and I don't fly ships with poor visibility, which means that I am strictly New Republic. And the reason for that is that given my background in sims and real-world aviation, I'm very used to being able to look around in any aircraft that I'm flying and observe my environment, which you simply can't do in ties, and as a result, I cannot stand flying them. I think ties are really cool from an aesthetic standpoint, but any craft designed for dogfighting is going to make visibility a priority. So in practice, no one in their right mind would ever come up with a design for a dogfighter with the very limited visibility of ties. So why is head tracking such a big advantage? Well, for one, it's much easier to avoid obstacles when you can actually look in the direction of a turn. I see people all the time talking about dying to pilot error, and I see ships smashing into things all of the time, but I can't recall a single instance of me ever dying as a result of crashing into an obstacle in a match. It's just not a concern with head tracking in a ship with good visibility. So naturally, if you're trying to keep a high survival rate, not crashing into things is going to be part of that. Another obvious advantage of head tracking is the ability to track targets visually, which I think is much more effective than using instruments and having to transition your eyes between those instruments in the viewport. This is something I could create a whole separate video on, so I'll just leave it at that for now. And finally, the ability to move your head around to survey your environment, which is much faster than turning your ship, is a great help, as it lets you see where engagements are taking place, where obstacles you can use for cover are, where health spawns are, mines, turrets, other threats. So it's really just a great help for general situational awareness. Another equipment advantage that I have is the HOTAS that I'm using. Now, I know that there's a lot of debate over what the best control method is as far as aim goes, and I'm not going to make any argument about HOTAS providing better aim, but I do think that they provide some pretty clear advantages in some other regards. One of the most obvious is the fact that you have a throttle slider or lever that provides direct and continuous control over throttle. And this allows you to match speed with targets very easily, or inch up the close distance, or back off to increase distance. And for this particular throttle, I've modded it with a center detent, which allows me to hit the 50% point for maximum maneuverability pretty much on thought. And that's a level of control that you just don't get with other control types. I mean, other than two sticks, which is functionally equivalent to HOTAS. Another obvious advantage of HOTASes is the number of buttons that are available to you. I mean, of course, on a keyboard, you also have a lot of buttons, so this is really just a disadvantage of gamepads more so than an advantage of HOTASes. But anyway, so for example, if someone shoots a missile at me, I just have to press a button on my stick and I can target it immediately. Whereas on a gamepad, you would have to bring up the targeting menu to do that. And that helps with missile evasion, which again helps with survival. But also things like power shunting and shield focus, you can bind those to 3 dedicated buttons on a HOTAS or on a keyboard, and that allows you to access those functions very quickly. A third advantage is not something that is talked about that much, and it's not really so much an advantage of HOTAS as it is an advantage of playing on PC and being able to use third-party software to add additional functionality to your control setup. I'm using Thrustmaster's Target, as I've been using it for many years and have a lot of experience with it. And one of the things that I'm using it for is to call up power presets. I'm using advanced power management, but I don't actually manipulate individual systems directly. Instead, I switch between 4 presets that I have bound to a hat switch. And I'll talk about the specific settings in the tactics section later, but for now, just know that this allows me to manage systems more efficiently than it would be possible with basic power management, but without any additional workload on my part relative to basic power management. And switching between presets quickly is very important to the way that I approach the game. Another thing I'm using Target to do is basically spam the shield rebalance button. And this means that if I take fire from the front, for example, my rear shields will almost immediately be diverted to compensate. And my hull generally won't be destroyed until my shields, both the front and the rear, are 100% depleted. So this allows me to stay equally protected on both hemispheres and fully utilize my shields without having to worry about managing shield focus at all. and I think that that has certainly contributed to my high survival rate. Some people may consider that to be a form of cheating, but my take is it's very similar to how in the olden days your success in some games was partially dependent on how fast you could mash the fire button. So controller manufacturers came up with controllers with rapid fire capabilities, and eventually game design that benefited from such mechanisms fell out of favor, and today it's very rare to see a game that would actually benefit from such a thing. Usually, if you want sustained fire, you just hold the button down. Shield focus in Squadrons is, I think, a similar thing. You know, I could manually spam the shield rebalance button, but why would I do that when I could automate it? So I think it's more of an issue with the design of the game than anything else. And to give some history, the original X-Wing games worked like Squadrons, and every time you took damage, you had to manually rebalance your shields, which was just annoying busy work. I think the designers of the series realized that it wasn't ideal, as in the later X-Wing games, shields rebalanced automatically. Of course, this rendered the concept of shield focus entirely moot, but it made for a better experience for the player. So what I'm doing by constantly rebalancing shields is making Squadrons work like the later X-Wing games did, and really I wish that Squadrons designers had learned from the X-Wing games so that that wouldn't have been necessary. A third advantage that comes from programmability is I often use boost in short bursts, and this is kind of a pain with boost being a toggle. So I have it set up instead to function as a momentary hold, so when I release the boost button I stop boosting, and that requires half the number of button presses. For drift, I have a separate drift button, and when I end a boost, if I have that button held, I will exit the boost in a drift until I release the drift button. Or I can just keep holding the drift button and hit boost as many times as I want to chain drifts, and that makes executing micro drifts and other advanced drifting techniques really easy. This approach to me makes so much more sense, and I suspect the only reason that the game doesn't work like this out of the box is that they had to accommodate gamepads. I mentioned before that I only fly New Republic due to VR, and for the most part I only fly A-Wing. I flew the X-Wing a lot as well early in my career, but quickly found that I was more effective in the A-Wing, so I decided to stick to it and see how far I could take it before moving on to other craft. And my KDR never peaked with the A-Wing, so I never really moved on. That said, I do fly X-Wing or B-Wing on occasion if it looks like, from checking player stats before the match, that my team has a large skill advantage over the opposing team. And I do well with whatever I fly. I'm usually first regardless. But I just do a lot better in the A-Wing. In particular, I find its auxiliaries much more appropriate for dogfighting than the other ships. And I also just find agile ships more fun to fly. The fact that the A-Wing is the best New Republic ship for dogfighting is no surprise to me, since it's the only New Republic ship specialized in the anti-starfighter role. You know, I wouldn't expect the X-Wing to be as effective at dogfighting because it's a multi-role ship. But I do think the A-Wing is the ship in the game with the highest survivability in a dogfight, and of course survivability contributes to having a high KDR. It may be the weakest Republic fighter in terms of shields and hull, but its high speed and maneuverability combined with its small size make it very hard to hit, and unlike its Imperial counterpart, the TIE Interceptor, it has shields, which I certainly think contributes to its longevity. The TIE Defender might offer some competition in regards to survivability, but again, I don't fly them due to their visibility issues, and they do have a pretty big weakness to ion weapons. Besides the A-Wing survivability, sticking to one ship, and for the most part one loadout, has allowed me to become very specialized. I'll be the first to admit that I'm a one-trick pony, but I've had a lot of time to perfect the approach and tactics that I use with the A-Wing, at least against the vast majority of players that I encounter in dogfight mode. So with all that out of the way, I now want to talk about the loadout that I'm using and the tactics that I use that are built around that loadout. But first, some general tactics. For one, I don't joust, at least in the A-Wing. Part of this is due to the background that I have in World War I and II sims, where head-on engagements are a bad idea. I think it was Sly Guy that said you lose as many as you win, which is really true, and those aren't good odds if you're trying to minimize deaths. Now, I know that this game is different because you can have builds that are optimized for jousting, and in fact in the X-Wing and B-Wing I'll typically take assault shield and rockets for that purpose. But even then, there's a risk, and this is doubly so for interceptors. I think their strength is in their ability to get behind opponents. So my A-Wing build is very much not a jousting build, and I do think that that contributes to my high survival rate. So instead, the way I approach the game is to get on my opponent's 6, to chase, turn fight them, and destroy them from behind. So with that in mind, for engines, I picked the standard engines because both speed and maneuverability are important for getting and staying on an opponent's tail, and every other engine option sacrifices one or the other. For hull and shield, I take the dampener hull and scrambler shield, which together increase enemy lock-on times by a factor of 3. And the reason is that I just really hate missiles. They're fairly easy to dodge in an A-Wing, but I just hate having to disengage targets to evade them or spend countermeasures because, I usually go the match without dying, so I need my countermeasures to last until I can resupply. For my right auxiliary, I use the targeting jammer, which I love because it has so many uses and can be used both offensively as well as defensively. You can use it to avoid getting hit, as well as to surprise and confuse opponents. One way that I use it, since I hate missiles so much, is as a preemptive countermeasure. If someone is trying to get a lock on me while I'm tailing someone, I'll engage the jammer, and that will immediately break the lock attempt, and often your pursuer will target someone else and forget about you. It can also be useful if you're pursuing someone and someone starts firing at you. Usually it's best to deal with the threat, but often engaging the jammer is enough to get them to target someone else and leave you alone. It's also useful when you're approaching someone head-on. I mentioned that I don't joust, so I'll typically dodge their incoming fire with a barrel roll or boosting to their flank, but I'll often also engage the jammer as we get close and start a preemptive turn to get on their 6, and that usually confuses them enough that you can get on their 6 without much trouble. It also disables their aim assist on you, making you harder to hit. I also use the jammer in turn fights. A lot of the times if you're up against an interceptor or someone with high maneuverability, you can get into an endless loop, and before that even happens, I try to prevent it, and the jammer is one way to do that. Once you engage it, your opponent isn't going to know which way to keep turning to stay on you, so you can usually get behind them pretty quickly after you do that. Another great use of it is if your shields are low and you need to recharge, you can get behind an obstacle and engage the jammer, and most likely your pursuer is going to lose you. And by the time they can reacquire you, you can usually get your shields back up. One of the more devious ways to use it is to get behind someone so that you have a clear shot on them and engage the jammer just before you unload on them. They'll be forced to evade, but they won't be able to target you, so they won't know who's shooting at them or where the fire is coming from. Just engaging the jammer when in a dogfight with a difficult opponent is often enough to get them to attack another target. It's strange to me, but I've seen otherwise very skilled players make this mistake, giving me an easy opportunity to get on their 6. The other auxiliary I use is seeker mines, and much like the targeting jammer, they can be used both offensively and defensively, so both are great tools for aiding in survival. And the fact that I don't carry missiles means that I have an easier time sneaking up on people. The way that I view mines is not so much as something meant to damage or destroy a target like a missile, but rather a tool for controlling space. When you drop a mine, you're essentially creating a no-fly zone within a certain radius, and this can be useful for getting people off your 6 or putting them on the defensive and corralling them into your sights. And that's something that applies even to experienced players that are good at avoiding mines. And for the inexperienced players, mines can be devastating and can typically kill an interceptor with a single hit. So one way I use mines is in non-jousts. If I'm approaching a target head-on, I'll often dodge their shots and then drop a mine in their face and then turn towards them. And what usually ends up happening is if the mine doesn't hit them, they'll immediately boost away from it, and this gives you an opportunity to get on their 6 without a turn fight ever even happening. If you are in a turn fight with someone, dropping a mine is a good way to break it, as your opponent will usually bail to avoid the mine, again giving you the opportunity to get on their 6. Another good place to use mines is if you're in the middle of a thick furball, especially on an open map like Yavin. You can just start spamming mines and you're probably going to hit somebody. Again, not skilled players, but there are a lot of players unskilled at avoiding mines, and sometimes even the skilled players get hit. If you're out of boost and countermeasures and turn into a mine's activation radius, there's not a lot that you can do. Another way I use them is if another pilot is doing what I call turtling, where they're either stationary or moving very slowly, rather than slow down to their speed, which would make me vulnerable to other ships, I'll intentionally overshoot them and drop a mine on them. Slow-moving targets are especially vulnerable to mines as they have very little time to react once the mine arms, so they're either going to have to move or they're going to eat the mine. Another way you can use mines is to shake pursuers. This is especially effective if you're flying through a confined space, as your pursuer will have to go around the obstacle to get to you. Obviously they can shoot the mine, but if they're close, it's really risky. For countermeasures, I use the Seeker warheads, and that's just because they have the largest ammo capacity, and that's very important when you're trying to go the match without dying, and you need them to last until you can resupply. For a primary weapon, I use rapid-fire cannons. I'd say for the first 25 hours or so, I use standard cannons, so you'll see those in my earlier videos, but I eventually switched to rapid fires. At first I didn't like them because I was always depleting my weapon energy store, but as I got better at managing power and juggling between engines and weapons to keep the guns fed, I came to really appreciate their higher DPS. I did like the Plasburst cannon quite a bit before they nerfed it. My main issue with it is the hit detection issues that I've had with it, and I made another video about that. But with the nerf, the choice of rapid fires is clear to me. So I'm going to talk now about some of the tactics that I'm using that are not related to my specific loadout. One of them is power management. I mentioned before that I'm using advanced power management with presets to switch between 4 different configurations. So I'll talk about what those specific configurations are now. I do have more configurations bound, but I found that I only ever used 4, so to keep things simple, that's what I stick with. The one I use the vast majority of the time is 840. The reason is that with maximum power in your engines, you have maximum speed and maneuverability, which is very important in a dogfight. But it also builds boost, which is absolutely critical for survivability. I feel like as long as I have boost, I can stay alive, but if I ever run dry, I'm very vulnerable. So it's very important that I never run out of boost. Once I get a target in front of me, I'm going to switch to 480 to maximize weapons and keep my rapid fires fed. But if I see that the target is starting to get away from me, I'm going to immediately switch back to 840. The third most common setting I use is 408, which is naturally for recharging shields and building a shield overcharge. I generally use this one in between engagements, so for example, if I just destroyed a target and I'm not immediately being fired upon, I'll often switch to 408 while I'm heading to my next target. Or if I need to bug out, I might engage the targeting jammer, hide behind something, and switch to this configuration to recharge. I don't usually use it in the middle of a fight, but I do sometimes on rare occasions if I feel I'm in a safe position, such as if I'm in a turn fight with a less maneuverable ship. The last configuration that I use is 804, which I should probably use more than I do, but anyway, it's the configuration that I'll select when I need to escape. It won't charge my shields the fastest or give me an overcharge, but it will allow me to disengage with full power to engines while not wasting any energy on weapons. And then once I'm in a safe position, if my shields are low, which they usually are in this situation, I'll switch to 408. One tactic that I don't use, at least in the A-Wing, is drifting. I know it's pretty much required for some ships like the B-Wing, but given the A-Wing's high inherent maneuverability, I don't find it necessary. I see people talking all the time about how important drifting is for staying alive and advising new pilots to master it right away, and it makes me feel sometimes like I'm playing a different game. To me, drifting makes you vulnerable. Everyone agrees that you shouldn't fly in a straight line to avoid getting hit. Well, when you're drifting, you're doing exactly that, and on top of that, your speed is decreasing. I'll admit that at the beginning of a drift, when you're moving at boost speed, you're hard to hit, but you're open to being hit just before boosting again. So when people are micro-drifting everywhere, that's when I hit them. So I don't know, maybe I could be a better pilot if I drifted more, but it hasn't been required for me to get to this point. Another tactic I'll employ is if I'm approaching a target at a high aspect angle and they don't know that I'm targeting them, I'll often hold my fire since it's harder to hit them at that angle, and wait until I'm right on their 6 before unleashing the full fury of my rapid-fire cannons. And the idea is to take them by surprise and destroy them quickly before they have a chance to react. And that is aided by the fact that I don't use lock-on missiles, so they usually don't have any warning that I'm there. To prevent that kind of thing from happening to me, if I'm in transit between targets and not doing a lot of maneuvering, I'll be hitting the target nearest threat button pretty much constantly to make sure that no one sneaks up on me. Because my build is bad at jousting, the most effective counter to it that I found is forcing a joust by using 180-degree drift turns. I really haven't found a good way to counter this with my build. Usually what happens when a good pilot is doing this is we end up in a stalemate, where either I'm being defensive enough that we can both heal the damage that we're taking faster than we're taking the damage, or if I'm being more offensive, there's a chance I could kill them, but there's also a chance that I could die myself. So if I was playing in a tournament or something where the average skill of the pilots I'm up against is higher, I would likely use a different build. But in public matches, it's extremely rare that I encounter someone who's able to pull off that technique effectively. So the build that I'm using is what I found to be most effective in public matches in general. And the reason I don't fly in tournaments is just because I can't stand flying ties. So that about covers everything that I wanted to say. I hope you got something useful from that. If you want to see any complete matches of mine, you can check my other videos, and I'll see you in space.